Hello and welcome to a series of interviews with candidates for City Council for the City of Santa Cruz. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and with me tonight is Martine Watkins, running for City Council. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
So Martine, new to City Council politics, what is it like for you so far running in the City Council race?
You know, it's been really incredible. It's been really humbling, and I feel like I've grown a lot as a person, as an individual. Making the decision to run is a big decision. It was definitely a decision I made with my family and had that support, and so it was really interesting. By trying to figure out whether it was the right thing to do, I started asking people, like, oh, I'm thinking about doing this, and you know, I was just overwhelmed by how incredibly supportive folks have been. So it's just been really validating that I'm doing the right thing.
That's wonderful. So tell us a little bit about your background that made you want to run in the first place.
Sure. You know, I think, you know, part of me, I think, has always just been sort of drawn to wanting to be part of change and in a positive way. But so some of the things, I'll tell you a few of the things that I've done. So I grew up in Santa Cruz County and then went to pursue my undergraduate degree at UCSC in legal studies. I always sort of thought I would pursue law. I worked in a law firm for a little while and it just didn't feel like the best career choice for me. And then I got into education and just loved doing the work there, but at the same time met a woman who was pursuing her master's in public policy at the Panetta Institute of Public Policy at CSUMB. And that sounded wonderful, really a nice sort of perspective of what I was wanting to do and kind of got a taste of with my undergraduate education. So I went to pursue my master's in public policy. And then, you know, after that, I just really felt a draw to be part of positive change. So I signed up to be on boards. I started as a board member of the ACLU local chapter here, was appointed to the Commission for the Prevention of Violence Against Women for the city, and I served on that advisory for about 6 years. And then just started to kind of volunteer for other things. So I most recently joined the Child Care Planning Council for the county on the Digital Nest Board, which is the nonprofit out in South County. So I guess I think, you know, for me, it's always just been this sort of draw to be part of positive change in some way or another. And this has been sort of the next step for that.
Right, and a lot of the organizations you mentioned are working in that arena. We all know child care is a big issue. City policy isn't exactly, you know, directly connected to that, although the city does support some child care services. And then the Digital Nest is all about training a youth. So there's a lot of connections there to city policy. And when you mentioned you studied policy, would you consider yourself a policy wonk? Do you love to make, you know, new rules and think about ways in which, you know, governing can change people's lives?
Absolutely. I love policy. And I feel really grateful because I had an opportunity to not only take classes from Leon Panetta himself before he went back to Washington to serve again, but he was really great at being able to help us as his students identify the leadership qualities and what it takes to truly move policy, you know, and that it's slow, but also the fact that, you know, just really the tactical skills really about public administration and what strategic planning and data analysis and policy analysis. So I had an opportunity to kind of get both sides. So I've been able to apply some of the tactical skills in some of the different capacities I've been in, and this is a different level with the leadership at the policy level making.
And you grew up in a household with somebody who is an elected official. Your dad, Michael Watkins, is superintendent of schools here in Santa Cruz County. Ran once in a contested election. How is it having him on your side? It must be a positive thing to have learned from his experience.
It's great. You know, he's an educator who had, you know, for the role that he wanted and aspired for and now has had to turn to politics to do that. And so it was really interesting, you know, being an adult and supporting his campaign and watching him transition from somebody who's doing the work in education to now trying to move his skill set and apply that knowledge base as a leader in public service. And so, you know, I really just admire him, not only because he's my dad, but he always has had students at heart. He's had youth at heart, and he's always led from that place in terms of his day job, but in terms of also now his leadership position. And then in terms of just navigating politics, you know, he's really helpful for me. I think as a woman, I think, you know, part of me is always a little bit a different lens, and it's really great to have, you know, well, why would you say that? You know, like a male perspective in that position of leadership is really nice for me. It's been supportive. It's been great.
Yeah.
I'm grateful.
So let's transition from policy. We're going to talk about some of the policy issues you might encounter and what your stances are on some of the, you know, lightning rod issues, if you will, on city council. But then there's the political side. One thing I've noticed interviewing a lot of candidates is people are trying to figure out what makes them distinctive from one another. There are so many people running for a few seats. And so faced with this rather large group of people that people won't necessarily meet face to face. What do you feel distinguishes you in terms of your group of issues that you really care about that people might resonate with, that might distinguish you from the other people running?
Sure. You know, I think for me, well, so I'll start with something that really moved me about my policy education, which was, you know, Secretary Pineda really always said we can either lead by crisis or through leadership. And we operate from that place. And so, you know, for me, in terms of what I've dedicated my volunteering and professional career to, it's really trying to be at a more proactive place. And so, I have 2 young kids, so having 2 young kids, you know, the future is very much so on my mind. And I believe that's the American way. That's our way, to really think that we're going to leave and leave a country or leave a city or a community better for the future generation. And so really my hope is to hold space for that when we're often sometimes stuck in a place of reacting to the latest crisis. And so I believe in the policy process, and I think that with the right leadership and the right counsel, you can really make a lot of movement on some of these lightning rod issues. Not only that it's going to impact the current residents of our community, but also the future.
Let's take an example that is top on your mind of all the, you know, various issues that the city's facing. What comes to mind is one that you feel like you'd like to dig in on right away?
Gosh, you know, well, there's one thing that I'm really interested in trying to pursue, and this is informed because I was recently appointed to the Dominican Community Advisory, and it's really been helpful for me to look at the perspective of community health. And so my brother, who is also an informal advisor and a dear and brilliant person in my life, is always informing me, and he has his master's in public health, about how we can better build community health. And so what I mean by that is that our experience in a community is more than just our individual health choices. And I think of places like, you know, Michigan, where we can clearly see and experience the experience that's happening there in terms of not being a healthy community, whether it be water or economy, poverty, and so on. And Santa Cruz is already incredibly healthy in many ways, but we can be purposeful about what we want to do and to build community health. So he most recently shared something called Health in All Policies, and it's a framework that was designed at the state level, asking local government to consider the health implications as they assess their policy. So it's not saying that, you know, this isn't my job, because my job is just safety or my job is land use or whatever. It's saying, you know, I'm going to consider what the health impact might be of all of the policy decisions I make, because there is one. And it also asks and offers an opportunity for us to work collaboratively, because if we have a dysfunctional program that's impacting the city, even though it's not a city-run program, then we can work collaboratively because we feel the impact. And so there are health impacts to that. So my hope is that, you know, by offering not only that lens personally on city council, that you could potentially, you know, for a low cost, if at a cost at all, have that framework embedded into our policy analysis process, so that we can all kind of live, work, and play here in a way that's sustainable, that goes to build a community that's healthy.
So let's take an issue that is really visible in our community. A lot of the people who are homeless on our streets are mentally ill and have no treatment options, but they cycle in and out of jail.
Right.
And I know that that's a county thing and a state thing mostly, not a city council, but city council does spend money on policing, which often, you know, ends up without a health outcome. So have you some thoughts on that nexus between mental health and homelessness that you might want to share?
Sure, sure. I think it's a great example. You know, we know the cause of homelessness, right? And it's often poverty or mental health or substance misuse and abuse. And so I think by criminalizing or using the criminal justice system as our default is sort of where we've landed. And it's important to think about how we can do things differently because it's not necessarily working. And I spoke to some folks in SCPD and just working in this community for a really long time, and they too feel that, you know, it's challenging. So I think, you know, what's happening throughout the state really, and probably throughout the nation in many cases, is that cities are trying to come up locally with solutions, right? And so what that requires is, sure, absolutely collaboration, looking at what kinds of things we have in place. Are they effective? If they're not, would we have the political will and the ability to sort of change things, try things differently? But ultimately, it's also about revenue and what kind of resources do we have? And so most recently, I was really interested to learn that the Northern California East Bay is doing a multi-county bond. And they're doing it to raise revenue, you know, at their local level to get the services adequately to address the impacts of homelessness and mental health issues in their community. And so I think that type of leadership is really required, that if we're seeing something that's not working, we need to start thinking about doing something different. And then also saying, how do we as a community either seek revenue, whether it be by reallocating, you know, revenue, or potentially seeking, you know, other sources of revenue, whether it be from the state or through a bond type measure.
So we have a lot of big issues to cover in the short amount of time. Housing's always come up, and we just transitioned from talking about homeless issues, which we could talk about for a whole half hour, they're huge, to just the issue of the housing crunch here, which has never really gone away, even though it's changed in nature. UCSC just added 625 new freshmen this year, so it's not going away. What are some ideas for what the city can do? There have been various attempts at granny units, you know, making them quicker to modify and upgrade. But what are some ideas you might come into council with to try to address some of the myriad problems? You know, Airbnb adding to reducing the housing stock. There's a lot of them. Of course, the council can't solve them all, but they could do good policy around them. So what are some new things that might happen to help it?
So I'll definitely talk a little bit about the complexity of the issue, and then I'll say a couple of things that I'm thinking. You know, for me, I think about the housing, and I think about how I appreciate the diversity, and I believe that our housing options should reflect that. And I fear that by not proactively really getting towards some of the issues with the housing, that we're missing and losing people, you know, because they're unable to stay here. And I think it requires everything. You have to give it all. It can't be one small or single policy solution. It's going to be needing to be a really robust, comprehensive approach, right? To really, truly, I think, make a dent in some of the affordable housing. I mean, it's also just recognizing, you know, Santa Cruz is a desirable place. People from, you know, here to the East Coast are gravitating towards cities because that's where employment is. So I think we can also recognize that, you know, people want to live here. You know, it's a beautiful place. People want to have their kids here. And so, you know, we have a desirable place to live. You know, the housing in terms of all the different options, like absolutely Airbnb, and thinking about the vacation rental policy. I know that the county was able to do some work around their policies at that level, so looking at what they've been able to design and how we could look at something like that here in our city. ADUs, looking at having an inclusive process with that in terms of you know, incentivizing people to turn, you know, their back units into, you know, legal ADUs that could be rented. You know, penalizing those that are not necessarily doing that legally, or also using them as rentals. You know, we have a housing trust fund, which is one way to really, you know, bring in some money for affordable housing. So I'd like to use that as an inroad to potentially see how that could be used as a mechanism to increase opportunity for affordable housing, some resources for that.
Let me pause you there too, because I understand that that trust fund, developers can pay into it instead of building affordable housing. Right. But then if it doesn't get used, it's not going to be creating new units, right? So there has to be a way to use it and somehow encourage them to build more, because without that, it just sits there,
Exactly.
not helping anybody.
Right. But it's a nice mechanism in place to
We're
potentially to use,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And then also, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is the fact that working people are often leaving Santa Cruz. I've had a number of friends unable to be here or be able to stay here because of how expensive it is to live here. So, employment-assisted housing could be something that we explore here, working with our local employers to see how we can support people with rental costs or grants or loans to purchase a home. Those are things that other communities have looked at.
We have artists housing at the tannery, and it was talked about it for a while to build teacher housing, I think, at one of the near Harbor High, but I'm not sure it ever got done. So
exactly, but
those
it's a
are good ideas.
Yeah, and it's something I care really deeply about because I feel like that if we don't adequately talk about our working people and how we need to meet their needs, because that's something sometimes we forget when we're sort of in the crunch of the crisis, we lose that. And so I hope to bring that perspective.
I've seen communities, in like Sun Valley, Idaho, where people have to commute 40, 50 miles from where they live because they cannot afford to live anywhere near where they work. And we don't want to become like that, where everyone's living in Hollister.
Exactly. That's absolutely right.
So let me try to move on through some of my other topics because time is generally short on these things. Another economic issue that you probably have thought about some, occupational studies have shown that there's a lot of home health aides and servers and those jobs being created, but they aren't at a living wage. Is there a minimum wage in the future of Santa Cruz that might actually help, or are you opposed to that? Have you thought about it?
Well, I think that it's in the right direction with the state in terms of moving towards the minimum wage, the $15 minimum wage. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. I think being realistic about our industry in Santa Cruz is really important to think about that, because I think about sort of my progression of life here. I started when I moved out of my parents' house, and then I worked at a coffee shop, and then I worked as a waitress for years and had roommates and shared my room, and eventually had the mobility and the options to increase my income to slowly be able to move in a different direction with my housing, right? And so it's also just and I still work in education, so it's not like I have a huge income, but I think it's also just really important to be mindful of our industry, which is health, and human services. It's tourism and hospitality and
higher
government
education.
And education, mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily equating to the livable wage that's required to be here. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't necessarily equate. And so when I was thinking about some of the folks that have been, really wanting to push the minimum wage, I had a conversation with a nonprofit director in town, and she was saying, we're really having to work and plan for this as it starts to approach, because we would have to lay off a number of our nonprofit workers if it was accelerated. So for me, it's really just being mindful about, all the different perspectives and unforeseen consequences sometimes of things. Mm-hmm. And
maybe how fast it comes about.
How fast it comes about, absolutely, absolutely. But ultimately thinking about how do we start thinking about high wage, high growth type industry in our community so that people can live and work and play here. It's an amazing place to live. So
another issue connected to that is, I think something like 40% of the workforce goes over 17 for better wages, but then they come back and they go onto the Highway 1 mm-hmm. corridor. So that's a big issue, is Measure D. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you've come out in favor or against it, and what you think about the bigger issues it has revealed in the discussion about transportation.
Yeah, I have come out in favor of Measure D. I think it's really a balanced approach to dealing with some of our transportation issues. And I feel like it's also really a big, it's a discussion of equity in many cases. I have the privilege to be able to work 5 minutes from my job. And, I was at a doctor's appointment recently, and the woman, who's younger than me with a kid the same age as my daughter, drives 2 hours to the west side, from Salinas every day. And that's tough, and I fear that there will be a tipping point where that just might not necessarily be worth it. And so I think about, it's really all interconnected, our business, our housing, our transportation, everything. But the roads are crowded. I mean, Santa Cruz is stuck in many ways, and we know that. So we have to start thinking about alternatives, about our metro system, about safety and bike safety, safe routes to school. And I think Measure D is it's fairly balanced, and I appreciate that about that bond. And ultimately, it goes to the voters. It goes to our region to say that we care and this is what we're doing, or not. So we'll see.
So that you mentioned Metro, and the cuts were really hard on a lot of people.
Right.
Instead of going the opposite way of having more bus service, we have now less.
Right.
And I know it's a complicated issue, but would there be a bond issue that would solve it? What's going to get us out of the spiral that is less bus service, where we want to be in a position of offering more?
Right. Well, I think that comes to economic development. So, I mean, people are either going to, take in walkable communities. I mean, I can walk to the grocery store from my house, and so my husband bikes to work every day. And so there's just sort of that concept of a walkable community, getting people out of their cars. So there's that, and then those that, I have 2 kids, and one of them is at school, one of them is at daycare. We have to go, there's pickups, and I have my computer, and I work throughout the county, and so it would be hard for me to get out of my car on most days. So just being realistic about kind of the different needs and demands, and encouraging as much opportunity for people not to have to use their cars, and to also just sort of think about the implications of when they do and how to try to mitigate that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move to another couple issues. So these are rather specific, but I wanted to get to them. Well, this one isn't. This is a bigger one, too, before we get to the more specific questions. Crime, petty crime, fluctuates throughout time, but it's starting to become a problem again. So petty theft, things getting stolen out of people's cars, and who knows what's causing that. It might be the economy, it might be drugs. Mm-hmm. What does the City Council have as its role, do you think, in policing and in supporting its police, but at the same time trying to balance its expenditures there with other things it needs, like what we were just talking about?
Sure, yeah, you're absolutely right. We have only a finite amount of resources. I've had the honor of working with a lot of our criminal justice partners for most of my career in education. So I've worked on a number of different diversion programs, working closely with our courts, our sheriffs, other law enforcement agencies. So I feel pretty, good about some of the different things that could be possible. I come from a lens of prevention, so I'm always thinking about how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place, and how do we effectively, deal with them when they do happen so they won't happen again, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, our criminal justice system, it's challenging. It's not working as effectively as it could, let's just say.
So City Council was in a pretty hot seat position when it accepted a grant for the Bearcat,
right,
which was meant sort of for paramilitary exercise. There's a lot of militarization, some people would say, happening in cities where that equipment, it's like being sold. And sometimes maybe it's needed, but a lot of the time the public feels a little bit scared by the ramping up of technology on one side. So what would you have voted for accepting the grant, do you think? I mean, it's hard to say now.
It's hard to say. When I wasn't in the position, I'm sort of like a researcher. I like to talk to everybody but I get the complexity of the issue. I don't, of course, want to see the militarization of our police, and also I don't put on a uniform every day and don't know what it's like to put my life on the line in that way either. I really was inspired by the sheriff's 21st century policing that he recently shared with the community about trying to do as much on the front end, as much as on the preventative end, as much community transparency as possible. And so I also have the ability to talk to somebody who works with SCPD, and I was able to learn there's a lot of really wonderful 21st century policing concepts that they're already doing that isn't necessarily, I don't think, known to the community. And so for me, I'm thinking, how do we be on the forefront as best we can to prevent, these types of things in the first place.
Yeah, and it's got to have been horrible for city councils around the country when these events happen where unarmed black men get shot, and it just seems like something's amiss in a systemic way, so I'm hoping it never happens here.
Absolutely.
That's just an editorial statement.
I think it's
hope it never happens under your watch either.
Oh, yeah.
Should you get elected. So a couple quick issues, because we only have 5 minutes.
No problem.
Are you in favor of a permanent sports arena? Would you be in concept or in reality?
Well, I'm a little bit partial because I am a Warriors fan. And I come from, a family of Oakland Warriors fans. And I think, the Warriors Stadium has been a really great thing for our community. And I, absolutely want to be, mindful and listen to the community or the area that it could be in, from the neighbors, to be as transparent and thoughtful moving forward. But I wouldn't have a problem with the Warriors having a permanent home here.
Okay, and finally, since we probably have to wrap up pretty soon, do you think there's certain personal qualities that make someone, and in your case, you, a good city council person? I know I've seen, the dynamics have changed over time. Some of the same people have come in and out after a while. You wonder where the new ideas, if it's hard to be a maverick, with new ideas. So what kind of person do you think you'll be if you do get elected in that environment with who's already there and who might be with you?
Sure. For me, it's I don't want to get onto city council to not get anything done, right?
Of course not.
I want to get stuff done. So I want, to find, allies and people who I can work with to really move things, So ultimately, it's just being able to bring people together, to be able to work together to do what's best for our community and for the future of our community. So I think, my experience working as a community organizer for years has really been beneficial for me to help understand all perspectives, to offer a balance of perspectives and do our best to compromise, because we are ultimately able to move and keep things moving in the right direction. So I hope to offer that and then be reflective and look at data and make sure we're on the right track and stay, transparent and accountable to the people.
And in 30 seconds we have left, just what happens when someone gets up and yells? It seems like that's the hardest part of this job, is angry constituents. Sure. And I know any elected official will tell you that's the hard part. So what is there a humor thing you can bring to it to just try to get through those moments?
If anything, I think just to make sure that they feel heard and to, let them know that I'm listening and will do my best with their input, however it's delivered.
Great. Well, thank you, Martine, for being here. It's been great, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Nice to meet you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
This has been an interview with Martine Watkins. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. Thanks for watching.